Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. U.S. President Donald Trump's meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House earlier this week had several issues on the agenda. While all of them are undoubtedly important, none are as crucial as the need to coordinate Washington's and Jerusalem's policy vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic of Iran and its nuclear program in particular, as it appears poised for a breakout which could lead to a declaration of their new status as a nuclear military power. With high-level American-Iranian talks about to begin in Oman this Saturday, what is the current situation following the Trump-Netanyahu talks regarding both the nuclear issue and the Iranian network of junior partners, which are hostile to both Israel, the United States, and the West at large? With us to explore these questions include, all the way from the United States, Professor Russell Berman, formerly served as a senior advisor at the State Department's policy planning staff, currently the director of the Middle East and Islamic World Working Group at Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It's great to see you, Russell.
Good to see you, John.
Also joining us from elsewhere here in Israel is Dr. Nir Bones, who is a project manager at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. It's great to see you as well, Neil.
Good to be here.
With me here in the studio, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set the stage for us.
So there is no daylight or even nightlight, if there is such a light, between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. No nukes. This could be the headline, the title of their common policy as regards the ends. Neither the United States nor Israel, and perhaps others, would allow the Islamic Republic of Iran to get its hands on military weapons with nuclear warheads. This is the absolute ground truth. Now, as regards the means to get there, obviously there was the Obama approach, culminating in the JCPOA exactly 10 years ago, which Netanyahu objected to at the time, and President Trump, when he was Trump 45 rather than 47, abrogated the American participation in the JCPOA, and lo and behold, 7 years later, here we are with President Trump initiating talks with the Islamic Republic, still under the same old management, Khamenei, starting, as you said, this coming weekend at Oman, which was also the venue for the old talks some 14 to 12 years ago, at that time led by Bill Burns of the State Department, later of the CIA under Biden. Now, for the next couple of months, we will have to wait and see whether there is any prospect of these talks being able to produce some formula. If not, it's back to not only to the drawing table, but also to drawing one's guns.
Indeed. Well, naturally, it's most likely a matter of timing.
Indeed.
Since the most contemporary experts within the sphere of nuclear science, to include two of those leading in their field, Dr. Olli Heinonen and Mr. David Albright, have voiced the alarm about Iran's intentions and the really rapid pursuit of the capabilities to even close the gap of the time necessary in order to break out to nuclear weapon capabilities.
But the U.S. intelligence community insists that no such decision has been made by Khamenei.
Indeed, and therefore I focus, of course, on even, they're talking now about 7 days, their Iranians' intentions, according to their practices in the field, according to the leading experts in the matters of nuclear science. Once again, they're trying to close in to even 5 and 4 and 3 days, that it won't take them any time. And for the United States to send assets into the region also shows their alignment with Israel on the matter of establishing a credible military threat alongside the diplomatic discourse that is set to begin. Professor Berman, I'd like to hear your take on U.S. foreign policy when we're talking about the Iranian file at hand.
There can be no doubt that President Trump is opposed to Iran's acquiring nuclear weapons. This was clear in his previous administration. It's been clear in every statement that he's made since then. In that sense, he's very much aligned with Israel. Obviously, Israel and the United States are in two different geographical locations. They have different kinds of skin in the game if it comes to a shooting war on this. They have different national interests, but on this one point, I don't see any daylight between them. Now, President Trump has also distinguished himself by an inclination to avoid military confrontation. He presents himself as the peace president in many theaters, and therefore it's not surprising that he's opting for negotiations first. This is not a surprising move on his part. We'll have to see how the Iranians respond. I don't think he's going to settle for an insufficient deal, for a resurrection of something like JCPOA. I think he wants to end the Iranian possibility for a weaponization of nuclear technology. The ball is really in Tehran's court to decide whether it wants to come out from under the sanctions or whether it wants to pursue its bellicose agenda.
Dr. Bombs, your take on that?
Well, in theory, there's not much difference between theory and practice, and only in practice there is. And if there is a difference here when it comes to this policy, is really the perhaps steadfastness of the Trump 47 administration and its ability to use a more credible threat when it comes to force. One of the most interesting moves that were done is the release of weapons that potentially could be used in attack against Iran by Israel. And then there's been some other reports that were probably released to the air just for the sake of having them there in the context of the credibility of a military threat. Regarding the strategic bombers, regarding the B-52, and the ability of Israel potentially practicing these types of aircrafts if there's going to be a scenario, which is not on the table at the moment, to use these types of fighters that Israel did not have and America may not wish to use for a kinetic operation. And that's something that was not done before. What was done before by previous administration is similar statements. You would not find a US president who would accept the idea of Iran possessing nuclear weapons. We've had plenty of statements in this regard, but there's been perhaps less moves in this direction. And I think here, Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump see indeed eye to eye. Where perhaps there are some subtle differences has to do with what the next step might be. I think if you would ask the Prime Minister, he would say that he would like to see a real credible military threat. He would like to see the United States leading this, and he would like to see the United States potentially participating in taking the Iranian capabilities kinetically. I think perhaps what he heard from the president, although I was not there in the room, is that that's not the priority or the intention of a peace president. But perhaps the negotiation is going to be a little different than the track we've seen before with the JCPOA.
We do need to take into account, however, that the Islamic Republic of Iran has launched hundreds of attacks against the United States of America, be it directly or indirectly. That's already not the focus of the fact, but nonetheless, Iranian directives have been very vocal of their foreign policy, which has two top priorities to include, of course, deepening their influence in neighboring countries and countries beyond their first circle, but also pushing the United States out of the Middle East quite vigorously. And there have been also very strong statements on this by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards and others. But nonetheless, the Iranians are not delusional about the power disparity between the United States alongside Israel in this context, but the United States also standalone is far more superior than the Islamic Republic of Iran. As diminished as it is today, even at the height of its power, it couldn't face the Americans and survive this campaign. And therefore, when we hear Morgan Ortagus, the deputy White House special envoy to the Middle East, coming out and stating on Al Arabiya, which is a Saudi station, that the United States will not allow the Iranians to drag their feet when it comes to their nuclear talks, is that resonating within the Iranian establishment, in your opinion, Mr. Oren?
Now, several points here. It's all well and good to see carrier task forces streaming into the Indian Ocean in the proximity of the Persian Gulf, and fighters and other aircraft in the air exercising with the Israeli Air Force and others. The problem of deterrence has to do with political will rather than with the assets in theater, because the United States is so powerful that it has a global strike capability right out of the United States.
I.e. power projection.
Out of North Dakota,
right,
and Wyoming and other places. Missiles can come out of the deep and go into the deep in Iran. And without going into details, Israel also has up its sleeve assets which it has never used, both kinetic and cyber. But this is good for the first strike. After the dust and the smoke and the blast effects settle, one needs to go and have the battle damage assessment and see whether this is a continuous campaign. And the problem there is that the allies and partners in the Gulf are vulnerable to Iranian retaliation. The Iranians have said so expressly. If we are attacked by either Israel or the United States, we will hit, you may fill the blank, Saudi Arabia and the others. Now, there is, of course, a much better air and missile defense system now, integrated defense, integrated deterrence. However, it is not enough. And therefore, one should not expect over the next several months to see such a campaign. But going forward, let's see the priorities, because what President Trump wants, as did his predecessor, is to pivot to the East, to the China-Taiwan issue. He doesn't want to be bogged down in another Middle Eastern war.
But therefore, and sorry that I'm cutting you on this one, because naturally the B-2s and the B-52s and the B-1s even that have been brought to the region, they could have stayed back in Alaska for that matter and still struck Iran. The whole difference here is time on target and the capacity to rearm those bombers in order to go and establish multiple sorties against multiple targets. And therefore, when we're talking about the Iranian capacity to truly fulfill or follow up on whatever Israel and the United States have in store for this Ayatollah regime, I'm very doubtful that it will be able to really fulfill its threats to the full extent of what they mean to do.
The issue here is not only what you said regarding the further sorties, and the U.S. Air Force is now not in the greatest shape, but the problem is to be in the Iranians' decision loop, so that if they do break out One day we will hear a surprise announcement that the assets are there so that if the decision comes out of the White House, it can be implemented immediately.
Indeed. Well, I hope that we will never reach that point. And on that, Professor Berman, when you look at the current decision makers, do you see the credibility in their notions with regard to the clear declarations by President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu that the Islamic Republic will not get to that point of attaining nuclear weapon capabilities?
Certainly, there's credibility on the American decision makers. I can't speak to the Israeli team, but I would be very surprised if there were hesitation in Israel. As far as the United States goes, as I said before, President Trump has been consistent from first administration into the second administration. It is the case that there's an interest in as they say, pivoting to Asia in order to confront China. But there's a debate within the administration as to whether the China question dominates all others or whether China is one among several strategic concerns of the United States. Oh, I guess the third version is that China is not only in the Western Pacific, China is also in the Middle East and in Europe as well. This would be an argument for a global understanding of the Chinese threat. So I am not convinced by the argument that China looms so large the administration's agenda that it's prepared to abandon engagement in the Middle East. On the contrary, there's high credibility in the administration's commitment to preventing Iran achieving nuclear weapons.
Well, strategic power competition in essence is global, and therefore to confront the Chinese encroachment on multiple fronts, including in Europe, as you mentioned, where we're seeing just a couple of days ago, the Italians coming out and saying that the Chinese continue to procure various ports and various other strategic infrastructure in European nations. It's raising the alarm not only in the United States, also in Europe proper. And that is something that is also something to take note of. But don't forget the forgotten continent, Africa. The Chinese are the leading force in Africa, along Russia, alongside Iran, to a certain degree. Also, the Turks are now growing in their influence in multiple locations, but that is also something that the Americans must make a point of. Is that not so?
China is, as you said, Jonathan, a global question, and there's particularly acute, obviously, in the West Pacific with the Taiwan question, against which Beijing has articulated specific threats. But China is in the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. And the United States will respond to this global Chinese threat. On the other hand, now I guess I'm backtracking a bit. I think there's going to be resistance to seeing China as an excuse for unlimited U.S. engagement around the world. There's going to be an expectation of making decisions about priorities and expectation as well that allies play a greater role in facing the Chinese threat. That's particularly with regard to Europe and its policies.
Absolutely. Dr. Bohms, from an Israeli prism, how do we see this?
Well, Sudan was one of the most interesting surprises when it came to the Abraham Accords, and that was a part of the forgotten continent. And that also has to do with the ties between Africa and the Gulf and the UAE involvement there, which is, by the way, not have always been positive from an Israeli perspective. But nevertheless, it has been part of the axis in the attempt to say, well, we need to do something with Africa because of the level of threats, the terrorism elements that became based there. And of course, the forgotten continent or the vacuum really left Africa to the hands of the Chinese and to the hands of the African and to the hands of the Russians. I think Israel understands that it has limited pawns to put on the chessboard. But part of what Israel has been doing in the past few years is also reaching out to a number of African countries, exploring along with the Americans, the possibilities of creating deeper alliances, of creating more normalization channels. Of course, for this to happen, Israel can offer only limited bandwidth, and it will need the United States to offer the rest in order to bring some of these countries back to orbit with the West and with the United States, and limiting the Chinese and Russian influences in the continent. From an Israeli perspective, this is important. We have actually seen and documented a lot of the weapons smuggling that came from Africa all the way to Gaza. This is something that actually enabled a lot of the power buildup when it came to Hamas. And of course, these interferences have even went through some of the countries that are our allies in Africa, including Egypt, with whom we have a peace agreement. And again, issues beyond the scope of this discussion, that the level of control or the level of influence of non-aligned forces that maybe the government was not able to completely control created a reality in where terrorist elements became apparent right across our border, and the Egyptians themselves were not able to control. All of that is happening and coming through Africa, a place that the lack of governability is even more apparent than in the Middle East. And that's a very important and significant arena. And that requires a policy of building more alliances on trying to find pragmatic forces that are interested in pushing the radical forces away, and doing this with the United States and with a coordinated effort, bringing Europe to the table as well, is important. And hopefully we'll find the bandwidth to deal with it as all those urgent issues and crisis points continue to really take the majority of attention from an Israeli perspective, without really leaving a lot of bandwidth to look at the second or third tier circles in where all of this is happening.
Thank you, Dr. Boms. Mr. Owen, obviously Israel has been, or not necessarily obviously, but since the establishment of the State of Israel until the early to mid-60s, Israel had very close relations with the majority of African countries. The United States utilized Israel to do its bidding at many of the occasions throughout that continent. Naturally, after the 1967 war was the major pivot of African countries in their relations with the State of Israel. But nonetheless, as Dr. Boms mentions, Israel is looking to deepen its engagement in Africa with like-minded partners and various nations there. Would that be also a possible potential for the reinvigoration of American utilization of Israel in those various spheres that, let's face it, as Professor Berman mentioned, it cannot establish itself in every corner of the earth at this age of strategic power competition?
Well, when the United Nations voted on Resolution 181, the partition resolution, there were hardly any Asian or African member states, which was good for Israel, because had they voted with the Arabs, perhaps Israel would not have been established by the UN. After the Suez-Sinai campaign of 1956, Israel was identified with the colonial powers, Britain and France. However, under Golda Meir as foreign minister, what happened was what you alluded to, that Israel, by helping the newly independent African countries, had a lot of status in Africa. This all came to naught after the oil embargo of 1973, because the Africans fell under hostile influence. As someone who have visited Africa with an Israeli prime minister on a whirlwind tour of 4 capitals in 4 days, China was the looming threat, even in fisheries, in all industries. So Israel cannot make too many inroads. It can make an effort, but when push comes to shove, we shouldn't have any illusions.
1 minute each, policy-oriented. What should we focus on in the next 24 hours to 1 year ahead? Professor Berman, we'll start with you.
The theme of this session has been the prospect of stopping Iran's march toward a nuclear weapon. That is a prime concern that will remain until the matter is resolved. In addition, I think we should be looking at the impact of the global tariff war right now. This could lead to a significant rebalancing of the relationship between the United States and China.
Dr. Bombs?
The very few positive dimensions of the October 7 war, the focuses are on the weakening of the Iranian axis and the ring of fire that was put around Israel, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen. The weakening of these proxy factors needs to continue as a continuing pressure point, juxtaposed with the current process, with the negotiation that just began over the Iran nuclear deal. If there's going to be a negotiation that are going to be successful, it needs to take into consideration the ensuring that this proxy process cannot be allowed to continue, that Iran will change course, not only when it comes to its nuclear program, but also when it comes to the region at large. That by itself can help push the normalization axis and bring some of the additional countries that had now been cleaned a bit from the Iranian influence into the Western orbit, along with the United States, along with Israel. The more we will be able to do on these two parallel routes, the better the region would be in terms of the safety and security for all of us.
Mr. Oren?
This is the land of prophets, but not even Isaiah or Jeremiah would have been able to give you a prophecy for the next 24 minutes, not only 24 hours. So later on, I will give you my prophecies in retrospect.
Well, they gave us prophecies for 3,000 years. I think they could have done so quite properly also for the 24 minutes. But anyways, Professor Berman, Dr. Bohms, Mr. Oren, thank you for all of your very valuable insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.